Can I be aware of myself as the awareness that perceives, without which there would be no sensory perception? There must be a consciousness that makes sensory perception possible. That consciousness, so to speak, incarnates in sensory perception. Sensory perception arises, it is created, by this consciousness. You would not perceive anything without the awareness behind it. So, become aware of yourself as the consciousness behind the sensory perception that makes it possible. Then you also practice this with auditory perception. For example, when listening to any kind of sound, natural sounds are especially helpful. Bird song, or the sound of wind through the trees, or the sea, the noise of water, any kind of water. You listen to the sound, you pay attention to it, but not 100% of your attention. Part of your attention is withheld and remains focused on the attention itself. Attention becomes aware of itself as attention, because you don't need to be completely lost in the sound. So you practice with relatively simple things, natural things, visual, tactile perception. Also the sense of smell. There may be a breeze, a certain scent in the air from nature or wherever you are, and you perceive that too. You might even be able to perceive a moment with all your senses involved. It's rare, but it is possible. You can taste, smell, touch, hear, see, all senses alert. But behind it all, there is a perceiving awareness. That gives you a resting point, a place of stillness. You are centered within yourself. You are rooted in being. So, you begin by practicing with simple things. This particular setting, a retreat environment, is helpful. And then, when you return to daily life, at home or at work, you continue practicing. It becomes more difficult there because more challenges arise. Many things demand your attention. So, you make the effort to stay connected with that. At first, you have glimpses of it, then it becomes more enduring. Eventually, you may be able to remain connected even while engaged in activity. And the next step is to remain connected even while thinking, so that thought doesn't absorb you completely. You can then think without losing presence. And that's when you've made it. That's it. That's all. And your thinking becomes more interesting. It no longer creates unnecessary problems. Much unconscious thinking creates a continuous stream of needless problems and amplifies challenges unnecessarily. That stops happening. You can have your attention fully in presence. If your eyes are closed, maybe 80% of your attention is in presence, and perhaps only a trace remains. If you're intensely present in a meditative state, there is nothing left of you as a person. In that state, you've become presence itself. And then there's little interest in sensory perception, because presence itself is so beautiful. That's how it happened to me, years ago, when I often entered deep states of the presence in nature. And you remain there for a while, but it's no longer about time. Then you open your eyes, and yes, you're still surrounded by beautiful nature. But I had this feeling. What came to me was a strange analogy. Everything I was perceiving felt like skim milk, but deep within, I had the cream, undiluted. Everything else was diluted consciousness. In India, they have a word for this absolute state of presence, samadhi. Samadhi is the state of complete presence. And for many years, I've said that what matters is becoming familiar with, learning how to access this presence, and then bringing it into daily life. At a certain point, I realized that in India, they've also been talking about this for centuries. They have samadhi, and also sahaja samadhi. Sahaja samadhi means you carry presence with you, that you don't lose it while interacting with the world. Sahaja samadhi is the next step, being present even while participating in life's activities. And I like to cite this parable from Jesus, where he talks about a man who built his house on sand. He built his house, and then the rains came, the storms, and because the house lacked a foundation, it was swept away by the waters and winds. And then there's another man, and Jesus describes him as someone who hears my words and puts them into practice, meaning he follows the teaching. And the essence of the teaching is, seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all else shall be added unto you. Exactly what we're talking about. The kingdom of heaven that is within you. Everything else is secondary, and it follows. So this second man hears Jesus' words and lives them. And before building, he digs deep. This is how the parable goes. He digs until he reaches the rock, and only then does he build his house upon it. And when the rains and storms come, that house is not swept away. It stands firm. So, What he's talking about is two states of consciousness. One that's not rooted in being and presence, living only on the surface, never having accessed the vertical dimension, which is presence. It only lives in the horizontal dimension. That's why the parable says this man digs deep. He goes deep into himself until he reaches the rock, presence, and builds his foundation there. That is a description of a consciousness rooted in being. And then, the things of this world are no longer a threat. They no longer create an unhappy person. The person has risen above circumstances. Circumstances still happen, but because the person is rooted in being, those circumstances no longer determine their state of consciousness. All teachings point to that, in different ways. Now, to counterbalance this crazy world that the human collective consciousness, or rather, collective unconsciousness, has created, the world you live in, counteracting it requires an extraordinary degree of presence. It's relatively easy to stay present here. Relatively easy because you are here, in a retreat. You have withdrawn from the world into a relatively protected environment. Even here, small challenges may arise. But out there in the world, things get harder, especially in the world we now live in. Many elements of our civilization are manifestations of a relatively unconscious collective mind. But even in the time of Jesus, the world was challenging, of course, in different ways. Perhaps there were fewer distractions or some major challenges, but not this constant bombardment of things happening all the time. There is never a moment just to be. Quoting Jesus again, he said, "In the world you will have tribulation," because that's what the world does. That part is my own addition. In the world you will have tribulation. But then he says, "But I have overcome the world." There will always be tribulation in the world, but he says, "I have overcome the world." He doesn't say he defeated it, but that he transcended it. He transcended dependence on the world. That was his awakening. But Jesus also says something many Christians surprisingly cannot explain. "All that I do, you too shall do," and even greater things. So Jesus is a forerunner, just like the Buddha. Both show what is possible, to realize your conscious connection to the source. So, out there in the world, I don't know what your living situation is. Maybe you live in a relatively healthy environment, at work or in your family. Or maybe you live in a rather crazy environment, at work or even at home. If it's a challenging environment, then you'll need to be extremely present. In difficult environments, where people around you are unconscious, reactive, possessed by the ego, identified with their mind, where conflict arises constantly, where there are arguments or fights. Hopefully no physical violence, but even that is just an extreme form of unconsciousness. Your presence, if you can remain present in such challenging situations, that is incredibly powerful. In a comfortable environment, yes, you can remain present. But that's like a flower growing in a greenhouse, protected from the elements. Or like a plant or a tree that grows quickly because it was never challenged by the weather. But once you plant it outside, it struggles to survive because it was never tested while growing. It never developed resilience to the elements. It didn't generate enough energy to withstand the wind, rain, cold, snow, or whatever comes. You could go to a wellness retreat in Hawaii or Bali, in the most beautiful setting where you don't have to do anything. Just meditate, eat the healthiest food, get massages every day, swim in the ocean or a pool. You receive all kinds of treatments. You're pampered. You're cared for. It seems like the perfect opportunity to be present. And maybe it is. Maybe you're present and you think, this is it. I've made it. But eventually, you have to leave. You run out of money. It's costing you $1,000 a day. And then, you have to go back home. But you think you're enlightened because you were so present. Then you arrive home, and with the first challenge, you lose it. A Buddhist monk told me this story. Someone I spoke with several times many years ago. He was an American monk who went to Thailand to be ordained at a jungle monastery. When he was young, his superior allowed him to go up the mountain, where they had little meditation huts. All he had to do was meditate all day. Once a day, someone would bring him food. So he meditated for months in that hut in the mountains, and reached sublime states of presence. He was convinced that he had achieved everything, but eventually he had to come down from the mountain and return to the monastery. Someone told him, "Did you notice your visa has expired?" He had to go to Bangkok to renew it, so he traveled to Bangkok. And there he was, waiting in line at the visa office for an hour. When he finally reached the desk, they said, "This isn't the right line." They sent him to another. Little by little, he began to feel dysfunction rising inside him again. After 2.5, maybe 3 hours at the office, they finally called his name, and he was so angry he slammed his fist on the official's desk. "I've been here for 3.5 hours and still haven't been helped." And in that moment, he realized what had happened. He had lost it completely. So that presence he had reached was superficial. Yes, there was presence, but he had not embodied it. He lost it. So the world is here to challenge you, so that you can embody presence through those challenges. When you get sick, that's a big challenge. When you lose something important, that's another challenge, and it's a useful challenge. Difficult people around you, another challenge. Only part of life's challenges come from what seems to be outside, from other people, from events, from things that happen. But a very large part of the challenges actually come from your own mind. And I would say, this is the greater part. Yes, external events happen. But the greater challenge is the unobserved mind, what your mind is doing and saying about your life. That inner narrative, the dysfunction, the misinterpretation of reality. When you see life through the veil of conditioning, when you can't distinguish between what is and your interpretation of what is, then you live trapped in a mental story. But when you suddenly realize, okay, this is the challenge, you're no longer complaining. You're just present with it. You're facing it, and through each challenge, even the smallest ones, your presence deepens. Like when your flight is canceled. You arrive at the airport and no one tells you what's happening. People around you are getting angry. You're either drawn into that collective reactivity, or you recognize this is a sign, an opportunity for intensified presence. And in that, something shifts. You actually become intelligent for the first time. You access what we might call a higher intelligence. If action is required, you act. Not as a reaction, but as true action. And if no action is possible, you surrender completely. And in that surrender, you might even feel peace. Maybe you sit there for 2 hours and nothing happens. Then you go to a hotel, or sleep on a chair. But it's no longer a problem. It doesn't create an unhappy you. Instead, it creates more presence. Some people have shared stories of receiving life-altering diagnoses from their doctors. Normally, when you're told that you have little time left, suffering arises. Fear, regret, resistance. But sometimes, something else happens. People suddenly become intensely alert and present. They refuse to leave the now. Without any guidance, and sometimes without having read any spiritual teaching, they intuitively realize, if I go into the future, I suffer. But if I stay here, there's peace. So they stay completely in the now, and they don't feel happiness, which is fleeting. They feel something deeper, life itself. There was a story of a British musician in his 30s or early 40s. He wasn't world famous, but he was well known. He was told he had about 1 year to live, but instead of going through a phase of suffering, he walked out of the doctor's office and immediately felt intensely alive. He had never read spiritual books, yet something awakened in him, a profound sense of presence and aliveness. He started living completely in the present. Later, in an interview, he said, "Why didn't I live like this before? Why did I wait so long?" What he felt wasn't joy or pleasure. It was something beyond happiness or unhappiness. It was life itself, a deep, radiant aliveness that doesn't need a reason. Why did he feel that? Because time was removed from him. There was no future, and without future, the ego cannot survive. The ego needs both past and future. It's constructed from memories and depends on future projections to feel complete, even though those projections never truly fulfill it. And in that moment, the ego collapsed. This also happens to people who lose everything through disasters, tragedies, or dramatic life changes. Not everyone awakens. Some stay trapped in suffering. But for others, it becomes the doorway to spiritual awakening. And now, you are here. Not because you needed to suffer more, but because you've already gone through that phase. Suffering may still visit your life, but now you can allow it to intensify your presence, not deepen your pain. You are consciously inviting presence into your life. You don't need more suffering to wake up. That is the power of awareness. And so, the way you deal with challenges begins to change. You're no longer reactive. And when you're no longer amplifying the challenge with your mind, something interesting happens. The challenge begins to dissolve, almost like a little miracle. What used to create tension and drama now passes more quickly. It even transforms into something else. Let's go back to a simple example. Your flight gets canceled. You fall into a reactive state, go to the counter, and start shouting, "This is unacceptable! You should take care of your passengers. You should." Now, what was once a small inconvenience turns into a huge drama. And what happens next? The employee reacts back at you, amplifying the situation even more. Suddenly there's a scene. Maybe someone calls the police. You're dragged away. These situations happen all the time. People lose control on airplanes, especially nowadays. Seats are cramped, people are anxious, they drink too much, they fall into unconsciousness. A minor challenge, being uncomfortable for a few hours, becomes a full-blown crisis. The plane is forced to land early, someone gets arrested. A small discomfort becomes a life-altering problem. This is a metaphor for how the world works. People constantly amplify their challenges, and then those reactions spread. More people get involved. One person's reactivity triggers another's, which triggers another's. And then there's violence, there's war. But it all starts the same way, with one human being who could not face a moment of discomfort without resistance. But when you don't fight the challenge, when you stay present and alert, something amazing happens. The situation transforms. You see new options. You notice help. You think clearly. You act wisely. And very often, what looked like a problem becomes an opportunity. And you think, oh, this worked out better than I expected. That's the power of not amplifying the moment. That's the power of presence. The present moment becomes your place of power. When you're here, truly here, you're no longer feeding the ego. Because ego cannot live without past or future. It needs the story. It needs to either remember or anticipate. But when you are simply here, now, there is no fuel for that mental identity. And in this moment, there's no fear, there's no regret, there's no anxiety. Just being. And in that beingness, there's peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from solving problems. Not the peace of everything going well, but a deeper peace. The peace that comes from no longer needing anything else. And it's from that inner stillness that real solutions arise. When you're not rushing, not reacting, not seeking, you become available to a higher intelligence, a wisdom beyond the thinking mind. You realize, I don't need to run anymore. I don't need to fix everything. I can let this moment be what it is. And strangely enough, that's when things begin to align. That's the mystery of presence. The more you surrender to what is, the more life opens to you. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped resisting. You became one with life. And that's where all the power is. Not in control, not in effort, but in surrender. And when that happens, when presence flows through you and begins to take root, you realize something profound. The awakening that's occurring is not yours. It's not you who is waking up. It's consciousness itself awakening through you. The you, the small you, personal identity, actually begins to fade. The more awake you are, the less personal you become. You're no longer interested in defending your image, no longer obsessed with proving yourself, no longer addicted to being someone. Instead, you are simply here, a space, a field of awareness. And from that field, life flows effortlessly. You don't say, I am enlightened. You don't claim, I have arrived, because the one who would say that is gone. There's just a quiet joy, a deep humility, a sense of being carried by something vast and wise, something that has always been there. But now, you're finally listening. When you no longer react to everything, you become truly powerful. Not because you're suppressing yourself, not because you're controlling yourself with force, but because there's awareness now. You see the impulse to react. You observe it, like a wave rising. But instead of riding it, you let it pass. And in that moment, you reclaim your inner sovereignty. People may say, but doesn't that mean you become passive? Not at all. You still act. But now your action comes from clarity, not reactivity. From presence, not ego. This is true strength, not the strength of resistance, but the strength of presence. And often when you don't react, the situation transforms on its own. Because you didn't add fuel to the fire, because your silence disrupted the pattern, and from that silence, something new arises.